Hi friends, my name is Dasha and today I'm going to be doing a book review of Pet Sematary by Stephen King. This is a horror novel about a young family that moves to Maine and live in this idyllic little farmhouse, and their neighbor across the street is a super nice old couple, and one day the man brings them out into the woods behind their house to show them what the town is called the Pet Sematary, where young kids bury their beloved pets, and everything just goes downhill from there. I really loved this book and I had a lot of thoughts, so I thought I would kind of jump on here and talk through those thoughts. If this is your first time on my channel, I use the CAWPILE method to both help me figure out what to rate my books and also to help me structure my reviews. I will put the link to a video explaining the CAWPILE method down below. It's essentially just breaking all the book elements down. C stands for characters, A is for atmosphere, writing, plot, intrigue, logic, and overall enjoyment. So without further ado, let's get into my thoughts. I should preface this by also saying I have never watched the movies. I did not watch either of the two movies before reading this book. I've never heard of the full story. I heard like a small, it's not even a spoiler, it's kind of a description of the book, but I heard a very small plot point prior to going into this, so I do not know most of what happens in the story before going into this, and I found that that made my experience a whole lot better. So the first thing I want to talk about is the characters. Now, I have read Stephen King before and I've generally had a pretty good relationship with his books. I haven't really had a ton of bad luck with his books other than The Outsider, and even that wasn't like that bad. And the one thing I find he does spectacularly in his books is his characters. His character work to me is always just on another level. He just has this way of writing everyone in such a realistic way that you're sitting there and you're like, fuck, how would I react to this super weird, super creepy situation? And the characters just react in like a very realistic way. They react in a way that you would expect someone in their situation to react. It's never these kind of, I don't know how to explain it, but the reactions always make sense. They always seem logical to how a real person would react when faced with these very odd circumstances, and it always just makes sense. And that's one of the things I really love about Stephen King's books, is that when you're reading it, it just feels very real, despite the fact that a lot of it is horrific and horror-based. The characters just feel like real people, and that was the case for this too. There are two young children in this family, and a lot of what they did felt very real, and the two parents. The main character that we're following, Lewis, is a doctor, so he is a man of science, and you see that classic kind of horror trope battle between a man of science who believes in scientific explanations for everything and rational explanations, and possibly being a man of faith who's grappling with wanting to believe in what's happening and wanting to believe in this supernatural explanation for things. And you see that battle within himself, and that's always something that I enjoy seeing in books. We saw it in The Exorcist, a man of faith grappling with a scientific explanation for things versus a possible supernatural explanation. And in Pet Sematary it also worked really well. Lewis just felt very well fleshed out, and I really enjoyed seeing him having to deal with all this and slowly spiral. One other thing I really appreciate about Stephen King is that every single one of his characters has a unique and very specific voice that is very purposeful. One thing I find sometimes, like in adult thrillers, for example, or young adult fantasy or dystopians, is that you could take any single character's dialogue and swap it, and it would still make sense in the story, and that's such a pet peeve of mine. But Stephen King makes sure that every single one of his characters has a unique voice, has a unique style of speaking, has a unique perspective that they bring to the story, and I always appreciate that so much, even though it is for horror, where dialogue maybe isn't, you would think, the most important thing. In this book, it is very central to driving the plot forward, the stories that some of the characters tell, and I really appreciated having a different and unique voice, especially for Judd, for example, the old man across the street that shows them the Pet Sematary. For him to tell these stories and show them these things, it was very important that he have a very clear voice and that he was able to convey the meaning of what he was showing to them, right? And Stephen King did like such a fantastic job on that, and I really appreciate when authors can really give their characters a solid special voice that doesn't sound like every other character could have said that. Next is the atmosphere that I want to talk about, and it is fucking phenomenal. So the majority of the book kind of takes place in only a few settings. You're either in the family's house, either out in the woods, or at Judd's house. There's kind of very little other movements, I find, and every single aspect of those three settings was just so well crafted. When you were at Judd's house, the neighbor, it felt like comfortable, it felt old-timey. When you were out in the woods, obviously you're feeling that anticipation, the tension, the creepiness of dark woods. Like, you felt it, you were there. And even inside the house, where there wasn't a ton of action happening, the atmosphere was just very, very well done. You felt like at any point a door can open and some shit would go down, or he would look out the window and you would feel like the tension in the fucking place was palpable. Even when they're walking out to the woods, either Lewis with Judd or Lewis with his family or by himself, the description of all the noises, the description of all of the like branches cracking underfoot, and all of the weird lights that they see, if there are any, or if it's just completely dark, like, you just feel so immersed, and it's really special, honestly. Like, the atmosphere was fantastically crafted. King truly has this way of making everything so ominous, even if it's innocuous. So at the beginning of the book, for example, you have the full scene where the family pulls up to the house for the first time, and they're unloading, and they're kind of looking at it, and it feels so idyllic and picturesque, and it feels so like, it feels picture perfect, and you just know that something's gonna go downhill, and you feel this dread. And I can't really explain it, but it's just this like superimposing of the picture perfect family moment with the shit that you know or you anticipate is gonna go down is just so well done. I loved it. The next thing that I'm gonna touch on is the writing, the plot, the intrigue, and the logic. I'm gonna kind of lump them all in together because there's just a lot of things I want to talk about within those, so it's a little easier. Stephen King's writing, like I mentioned, for atmosphere building is just really special. Like I said, he has a way of building the tension so masterfully throughout the whole story, even in those kind of picture perfect innocent moments. And I found that the pacing of it to kind of build up and then release with like the horror was so well crafted. Even like the smaller moments when stuff starts kind of happening and then it's like calm for a little bit, he builds it up so well. On the point of writing, I will say Stephen King has a bit of a habit of over-sexualizing things. So, for example, I read The Long Walk by him when he was writing as Richard Bachman, and that book was about teenage boys, so I didn't take it too seriously. Teenage boys are disgusting creatures, if we're being entirely honest. Of course, they make everything about tits and ass, but I felt like this grown family man who's a doctor making analogies to like female body parts was just a little jarring. It kind of took me out of the story sometimes, and I felt like it just kind of wasn't necessary. But that's one of my like real only gripes with his actual writing, because I find Stephen King's writing is very clear. It's very easy to follow. I never have issues following along or having to go back and reread stuff. Any action scenes are very clear, they're very clean. I really enjoy them. So it's really just those weird things he does sometimes that just kind of take me out of the story. But overall, like, that's kind of one of my only gripes with the writing. Another thing I wanted to touch on is the themes. So very often in this video is going to sound like I'm ragging on young adult, and I'm not, but I'm going to draw the comparison again to young adult because that is the bulk of what I have read until recently. Very often in young adult books that are fantasy, sci-fi, or dystopian, which is what primarily I do read, usually have themes of like race, class, despot governments, revolution, freedom, that kind of stuff, and it often feels very heavy-handed. And I kind of find it gets old after a while. It's kind of repetitive, and you feel like there's nothing really new happening. For example, like Hunger Games was the blueprint for a lot of those types of books, and in that book it was very well done, and it wasn't, well, the main purpose of the book was revolution. There was other smaller discussions about propaganda, for example, that were being done. I just felt like afterwards it went downhill. If an author was talking about racism or trying to handle it in their book, it was just so very heavy-handed, and it just wasn't really it was too obvious. All this to say, Stephen King does talk about very heavy topics in Pet Sematary, namely grief, both how children handle it, how adults handle it, how it can screw you up, and just the mental health effects that it has. And he also talks about trauma. And while these were obviously clearly discussed on the page, it was not so heavy-handed that it felt shoved in your face. And that's one thing I like about horror in general. You kind of have to look at it a little differently to see that there are actual really real topics and themes. It's not just gratuitous horror most of the time. But there's also this element of the subtlety that, yes, obviously at the beginning there's some discussions of grief between Lewis and his daughter, and it's an actual on-page discussion that they're having. And Ellie, the daughter, is quite young, so she's having like a very honest and open discussion with her father about grief. But later on in the book, when some of the characters are faced with actual grief, and it starts to impact their decision making, and you see their inner monologues and how that kind of goes into a downward spiral from there, it's really interesting to see how he handled that without shoving it in your face that this book is partially about grief. Here you go. It was more the side effects of grief and how it can kind of transform into decision making and how it can alter your decision making and make you take very bad decisions like Lewis did. And it's just such it felt very, very masterfully done. It felt not overbearing, like I said, not in your face and heavy-handed. It felt as though obviously it was clear that that was his intention, was to talk about grief and trauma and those topics, but I appreciated that it didn't take the complete forefront. And in fact, the way that grief was so real, and it is something that humans experience, almost added to the horror element of the story, which I personally really appreciated. Overall, I just really enjoyed my reading experience. I have never, like I said, watched the movies or heard of the full story prior to going into the book, which made it so much better, and I had a really enjoyable time with it. I gave this overall a 4.5 out of 5 stars. Like I mentioned, there was the weird little writing issue when Stephen King would like over-sexualize things kind of took me out of it. And I also felt that there was, I don't know, I just didn't get that 5-star feeling. But overall, it was so masterfully crafted that it is one of my favorite horror books now, absolutely for sure. I would recommend this book to anyone trying to get into horror because, like I mentioned, there are a lot of themes behind it. It's not just pure disgusting horror. There's no gratuitous body horror or anything along those lines. It's very suspenseful. It's very profound in terms of some of the themes that it tackles, like I mentioned, and it's scary, dude. Like, there's some scary stuff going on in there. It just, when shit hits the fan, and it keeps you on the edge of your seat. So if you have not picked this up yet and you're either looking to get into horror or you do like horror, I really think you should. Also, I heard from people who have watched the movie that based on what I was telling them about the book, they have omitted certain things and they dramatized certain things in the movie. So I would recommend reading the book even if you have watched the movie and you know what happens. I think because of how well the book was crafted, you might still enjoy it and get something fresh out of it that's not just kind of dramatization and gratuitous horror that you would see on screen. I'm also going to very briefly go into a little spoiler section. So this is your official warning. I said all I've needed to say for like recommendations or not. Like I said, if you have not read it, have not watched the movie, or have watched the movie and aren't really sure, please pick it up. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. And this is your official spoiler warning. I'm about to go into a little bit of spoilers because I kind of want to discuss things a little bit more. One other thing I will say, so while I mentioned this was like fantastic and phenomenal and well crafted, this was not a 5-star read for me. And another one of the reasons I think it wasn't was, so at a certain point, right before the part where Lewis's son dies, Stephen King starts going very heavy-handed on the kind of foreshadowing. He's like, little did he know at this point that his son only had 2 months left to live. And I was like, well, that's kind of shit. that didn't need to happen. I would have been so floored if I would have just went into the next chapter and fucking Gage is dead. Like, I would have been so much more floored. But then with the heavy-handed premonition of what's gonna happen, it just kind of killed the vibe for me a little bit. Which is, I know I just spent like 10 minutes praising Stephen King's, you know, building of the plot and the intensity, and that was kind of the only other thing that made me kind of take it back a little bit. Additionally, in that section of the book, so he went through the way it happened and the funeral and all that, and then at some point, I guess, Lewis had a dream where none of it had happened, and it just was very abrupt, and I felt like it didn't really need to be there. I felt like it would have been okay if you just kept going with the story rather than give us like this dream sequence where everything was okay and then have him wake up and his son is still dead and all that kind of stuff. I felt like it was just a little unnecessary. I don't know if anyone that's read the book has any thoughts about this, please let me know. Maybe there's a purpose for it. I felt like it just kind of was a little jarring and really annoyed me. But man, the whole time that he was having this like inner monologue about whether he's gonna go bring his son to the pet cemetery to bury him, I was like, don't fucking do it. Don't do it. But like, I'm not stupid. I can see that I'm only 80% of the way in. There's 20% of the book left. Of course something's gonna go down. Of course. And once it did hit the fan, holy shit, that was exhilarating. I flew through that. I did not see some of it coming. I did not expect Gage to walk into Judd's house and kill him and then kill his own mother. That shit was wild. Maybe I'm stupid because I did not see any of it coming. And then the final scene of Lewis being so grief-stricken about his undead son killing his wife that he walks to the pet cemetery to bury his dead wife so she can rise again. I thought that was the most, oh my god, it was so good. It was so good. Listen, I did not see, I anticipated that his son would come back. I thought because there was not that much of the book left, like I thought if his son had died once I read it, that he was going to bury him right away and then there would be like a slow progression to kind of build up the tension. We kind of find out earlier, right, that some of the animals that come back have this like slow build, like they're kind of not right at the beginning, but they're not violent or anything. So I was anticipating for him to bury his son if he would do it, and his son would come back and it would be kind of like a slow burn. But no, shit hits the fan, takes off running, Gage turns into a murderer. It was so good. It was so good. Again, maybe I'm dumb because I didn't see it coming, but I loved it. Anyways, I think that does it for today's video. If you guys like this, please subscribe. I will be posting more book reviews for sure. This stuff is a lot of fun. Otherwise, my socials are linked down below, and I will see you guys next time. Bye!